Morning.
This is Taunton, the county town of Somerset. The only real mention of the Civil War here is this plaque in the local Wetherspoons pub. Despite outward appearances, Taunton and towns like it were hugely influential in deciding the outcome of the English Civil War. While the Roundheads and Cavaliers may have famously clashed at battlegrounds like Edgehill and Naseby, the real sites of conflict were in sieges up and down the country in places like Taunton. And central to Taunton's success is local hero Robert Blake. Blake was born here in Bridgewater in 1598. He was the son of a local merchant and was quite a short and stocky man. He's only about 5.5 feet tall. His contemporaries noticed that he had a bizarre and often sarcastic sense of humour. He was an early riser and loved sports, particularly fishing. And according to one biographer, catching swans. When he was 18, Blake studied at Wadham College in Oxford. He stayed there for 9 years and developed his political opinions. He only came back to Bridgewater in 1626 on hearing that his father had died. He then tried his hand at a number of jobs before finally becoming the MP for Bridgewater in 1640. When Blake was an MP, he was always keen to try and cut back the powers of the Crown. He was also a Puritan, and this influenced the decision to join Parliament on the outbreak of civil war in 1642. Taunton had also sided with Parliament. It had a large Puritan following and also a general hatred of Charles I. For one thing, Taunton resented Charles's reinstating of ship money. Ship money was an old medieval tax that was payable by coastal towns in times of war to stop their ports being attacked. Charles had reintroduced the tax without the consent of Parliament to peacetime to places like Taunton, which is 15 miles inland. Tauntonians were furious with this and refused to pay, whereas nationally 90% of towns paid their owed ship money. So Taunton was quite strongly against the king. But the Royalists seized the town in 1643. While the Cavaliers were making themselves comfortable at the expense of the local population, Robert Blake had already made an impact as a Parliamentarian commander. During the siege of Bristol in 1643, he continued defending this site, Priors Hill, for a further day because he didn't believe the Parliamentarians in the city had actually surrendered their positions. Unfortunately for Blake, they had, and he very narrowly avoided being hanged for insubordination. So, as a proven commander, he was given the job of retaking Taunton. Fortunately for Blake, when he arrived in Taunton with a force of over 2,000, the Royalist garrison at the castle had been reduced to just 80 men. The Parliamentarians took the town without a single shot being fired. Now that they controlled Taunton, the Parliamentarians were able to halt or to hinder Royalist forces moving up from the southwest to Bristol, Oxford or London. Cornwall in particular had a huge Royalist army with war-winning potential, and Taunton was the bottleneck. For the same reasons, Taunton became one of the Royalists' top priorities. The Parliamentarians would have to survive 2 major sieges in order to hold the town. Rather than trying to fortify the entire town, Blake initially concentrated his defensive efforts on a few key locations, like here at St Mary Magdalene's Church. The tower provided them with an excellent vantage point. The problem with this strategy was, during the first siege in 1644, the Royalists were able to isolate Blake's strongholds, like the church, and break through his lines by outflanking his men. The Parliamentarians learnt this the hard way, and by October they had been forced back to the castle. The situation was so desperate that Blake asked his men to fast for 1 day a week to save provisions. But such was his influence and his men's determination, it said they offered to do so for 2 days instead. The Royalists were unable to starve the garrison here at the castle, and the Parliamentarians were eventually saved by a relief force sent from Chichester. It arrived on the 15th of December and it ended 7 weeks of siege. Blake realised just how close the garrison had come to falling and immediately pressed ahead with new and more extensive fortifications. And some of these defences are still visible. Tucked away here in the grounds of the castle and completely covered by weeds is this bastion constructed by the Parliamentarians in early 1645. And there's more evidence for construction at the gatehouses of the old town. As well as this flurry of defensive activity, Blake had learnt from the first siege, which was quite rare for commanders of the time. He knew he would have to change his tactics if he wanted to beat the Royalists. The Parliamentarians dug dozens of lines of defensive trenches and fortified many buildings. These are the trenches that we have archaeological evidence for. Blake also used the lie of the land. He used the Stockwell and Sherford streams to protect the south of the town. His men were spread much more thinly along the lines, but they were much more difficult to outflank. This was Blake's stroke of genius, and it made Taunton far harder to take. The Royalists were now determined to take Taunton to improve their chances of winning the war. They again approached the town on the 11th of March. Luckily for Blake, the Royalists were now hampered by arguments and infighting. Several generals refused to move their armies, and Lord Goring, who was actually positioned outside of Taunton, ignored his orders completely and went to Bath to, in his own words, recruit his health. This delay gifted Blake more time to finish off his defences, but the Royalists finally returned in early April. But even under an intense siege, the Royalists were unable to break through Blake's new defensive lines and his new tactics. It wasn't until the 6th of May that they made their first breakthrough, when they took the Vicar's House fortification, the remains of which are still visible here today, but they're completely hidden away behind the church. And at the east gate, Blake issued his men with boiling water and stones to save gunpowder. Amazingly, they were able to hold off the Royalists for several days. During the very height of the siege, the Royalist commander, Lord Hopton, offered Blake honourable terms if he was to give up the garrison here at the castle. Blake refused and said that he had 4 pairs of boots left and would eat 3 of them before he surrendered. Although the Royalists had taken almost the entire town, Blake's nerve had held and his tactics had sufficiently delayed the Royalists' attack. At 4 o'clock on the 11th of May, the Royalists finally retreated. Taunton had suffered greatly during the war, and up to 2/3 of the town had been destroyed, this area in orange here. This is still evident today. If you look on the east side of the town, there are no buildings that predate the war, whereas if you look on the west side, many buildings are older in date than the conflict. So the scar of the battle is still visible to this day. The national significance of the Parliamentarians holding Taunton was in occupying Lord Hopton's army, which was unable to join with Charles's at Naseby, the decisive battle of the First English Civil War. In fact, Hopton's army was actually larger than Charles's at Naseby, and it could easily have swung the battle in the favour of the king. So Taunton had, in its own way, influenced the course of English history, and in no small part thanks to one man. Robert Blake went on to become one of England's great admirals under Oliver Cromwell's protectorate. Despite this, he's virtually unheard of outside of Bridgewater. And with just a single plaque in a pub to remind people of Taunton's influence on the Civil War, this small town's past seems as neglected as Robert Blake's. But the story of Robert Blake's year in Taunton should serve to remind us of the role of the smaller places and of the less famous people behind the great events of history.